Well, happy Sunday, everybody. I'm here with Dr. Stanton Peel. I'm Zach Rhodes. We're going to go back to our roots in creating this show and talk about mainstream narratives of drugs and addiction and, how they're portrayed in the media and TV shows and otherwise, which is why we started this. The idea that one reason we can never come to grips with truths about drugs or addictions or think of them in a common sense way, the way we might in some other instances, like if it were our own family members or something like that, we can't actually get the general fundamental truths about addiction into the air for some reason. Well, one reason, and maybe the the fundamental reason we can't do that is because of the way that drugs are portrayed mainstream and the myths that just are so easy to latch onto and perpetuate. But we've kind of seen a change of pace, almost like a retroactive kind of idea about what drugs are or aren't in some shows. And actually, I thought before you wrote this piece about it, which I just gave that away, but I was thinking maybe I could come up with some examples of that, and I think I could do no better than you did in your recent article for Filter. You've come up with examples in shows recently and juxtaposed them with shows in history where drinking was no big thing. We don't have to tell a story of AA or if somebody's drinking a little bit more than a sip of beer, then they have to have a problem and they have to be in rehabs. So maybe we could start with that, talk about your piece and some of the key points in it.
Well, I've always from the start been tuned into the media, and I was aware before the concept of narratives came into play. There's a big article in the Atlantic by a brilliant writer named George Packer, where America is divided into four groups. And he says the freedom group, which is kind of upscale libertarian Republicans who say, well, no, regulations, let us make money. Americans, which are kind of like white people who resent encroachments by immigrants. Then there are smarts, which are meritocracy Democrats who say, oh, let everybody achieve, except they control all the parameters of achievement, the schools and the education. And then there are justice. And those are people who reject the power structure in its most fundamental way, in a way they could just say, you're a white male and you're out.
Mm-hmm.
And so George Packer seems like a pretty happy man. He's successful. He's not happy about this. He says, well, I don't want to, he would be in the smart group. I don't want to live in any of those Americas. And the point he's making is all of those Americas, they're different worlds. The same things happen in the world. We see, there's COVID and there's economic whatever, but each of them experiences an entirely different world. It's like they live on a different planet. And so that's the most extreme form, and it's developed in our time. But I've always been aware that that's true about drugs because something maybe similar happened to you. I would meet different people who took drugs, and their experiences wouldn't be like what you saw on television.
Right.
And so let me just give one media example that I've always been aware of. I wrote about in America, there was a noir film called The Man with the Golden Arms, starring Frank Sinatra, about a small-time hood in Chicago. It was written, a book by Nelson Algren. And he goes to prison, and he's a heroin guy. And he goes to prison, he climbs the wall. The film doesn't actually mention heroin. Everybody thinks it's heroin. In Nelson Algren, it's actually morphine, but close enough. He goes to prison, he climbs the walls, and then when he gets out of prison, he's always relapsing and climbing the walls. So that's the Nelson Algren story, and maybe it's based on something. In 1978, they made a film about a guy whose story is kind of unbelievable, and his memoir was called 1 in a Million. His name was Ron LaFleur, and he became a major league center fielder in an unusual way. He lived in a Detroit slum. His father was an alcoholic and his mother was a healthcare worker. And he took heroin every day and he stole, and he got arrested and he went to prison. And they had maybe he's a major league player who would come by, this is in Detroit, and he ran a baseball team, and he saw LaFleur kind of walking around. And he looked at him and he said, well, we have a baseball team. Why don't you come and play? And he said, I've never played baseball. But when you look at him, he's an athletic guy. By the way, the first thing I think of when I look at Carl Hart is he looks like an athletic guy.
I think that too.
I mean, and in his life story, he didn't especially go to school. He stayed in school to play basketball. Ron LaFleur didn't bother to go to school. He missed that part. He went to prison, and the guy said, well, come on out and I'll show you how to play baseball, which he did. The story is called One in a Million. And he happened to have a cellmate who was a white guy embezzler who was friends with a guy who ran a bar that Billy Martin's a guy, a lot of bad things are said about Billy Martin. But the guy in prison said, there's a guy here who's a good athlete. Could you guess Billy Martin to come out? And Billy Martin came out to the prison. And, LaFleur was only in for burglary. He hadn't shot anybody. And Martin said, well, can he play, in the Detroit farm system, minor leagues? And then 2 years later, he's playing center field for the Detroit Tigers. In the book, the Man with the Golden Arm has these scenes of, Frank Sinatra climbing the walls through withdrawal. In the book, LaFleur goes, well, I took heroin every day, and I, didn't know what to expect when I went to prison, but when I stopped taking heroin, I didn't really notice it. And he actually gave an explanation for that. His explanation was because every day he had lunch and his mother made him a warm lunch. How do you interpret that explanation for avoiding withdrawal?
Because he came in for a soft landing from his, using drugs, and then what do you have to fall back on when you stop using drugs? It's not clear exactly to what extent that pads the withdrawal, but it seems like it has the most major effect than anything. If the life you have to go back to is reasonably nice.
Well, that's why he didn't go into withdrawal entering prison. Although a lot of people don't go through withdrawal when heroin. I mean, a lot of people don't go through withdrawal when they stop drinking alcohol, or people go through withdrawal when they quit smoking and coffee. In fact, no, to say that is to make a radical declaration. Smoking and coffee are more withdrawal encouraging than alcohol and heroin. So let's go back. We're in prison, and the Man with the Golden Arm, we don't want to tell a story about people getting better in prison. The Man with the Golden Arm, he's constantly relapsing, and Ron LaFleur didn't relapse, but our explanation would be, well, he became a Major League Baseball player while he's in prison, which doesn't occur very frequently. Just as, Carl would say, not a ton of guys in his neighborhood became neuroscience professors at Columbia. That's not an actual cure. However, you could see that would be helpful.
Right.
So they made a movie about Ron LaFleur's life, and I was a two-part TV series movie. And when I watched it, I was fascinated. They're not going to show Ron LaFleur shooting heroin every day, going to prison and not noticing that he's not taking heroin anymore. That's not going to happen. So they have his brother taking heroin and going through withdrawal, and he has to be chained to a bed in the basement to overcome it. You're not allowed. It's against the law to violate a deeper law than, where they arrest you. Everybody believes something. You're not allowed to show something different. So,
it's a pain. It would be a pain in the neck because you'd be doing something so different. If you have a guy and it's part of your storyline that he's using drugs, and then you just make the recovery from it trivial, it's almost like there's a spotlight on that it either ruins the storyline or the onus is on you to explain, well, why did this happen? This is crazy. It's a pain in the ass. You don't want to. I mean, it's just not worth it.
It'll become the Ron LaFleur went to prison and stopped taking heroin and didn't notice any symptoms would be the story. And the story is about how a guy went to prison and became an all-star center fielder. So I've always, and I write about that in The Meaning of Addiction. And so at some point we're going to mention my memoirs out, by the way. I've always been interested in that. And so recently during the pandemic, I was watching reruns of Gunsmoke. Don't tell me I got nothing to do. And if you remember, they spend a lot of time in a saloon. James Arness, Marshall Dillon's, it's not clear that she's his girlfriend. Kitty runs a saloon, and people are always drinking, and Doc and Chester and Kitty and Matt are always sitting around drinking beer, but they never get drunk. Every once in a while there's a celebration, so they'll break out some whiskey or something. And, you know, there's actually a town drunk, in quotations, but they take care of him and nothing bad happens to him. And actually in one episode, he becomes a hero by not drinking. And so it's a whole community dealing. People drink. They don't have problems. Occasionally there are problems with an individual or violence. The community takes care of it. C'est la vie. Alcohol and it was at one point the longest running successful series in American television from 1957 to 1977. And that's sort of, people thought of that way about alcohol. In 1987, a whole new concept was introduced by Candice Bergen. We'll cut it out of the article. Candice Bergen entered Penn the same year that Archie Brodsky and I did. Murphy Brown is a journalist, newscaster who's a recovering alcoholic. And from that moment on, recovery had already become really major in the 80s. And Betty Ford had gone to, became the Betty Ford Clinic. And all of a sudden, America's ideas about alcohol and drugs changed, alcohol especially, because they were always biased against drugs, to, oh, if you drink, you can become an alcoholic, and a certain number of people become alcoholics, and then you have to go through recovery. You have to go to AA, and then you have to abstain. And that became the cultural meme about alcohol, that you're not allowed to violate. And if you go to Moms, which is a story about a mother moving in with a daughter moving in with her mother, it's a big hit for 5 years. I think it's just going off the air. Allison Janney is the mother, and Annis is the daughter, whose book, Unqualified, I read and loved. There's no alcoholism or drug addiction in her memoir, even though people drink and take drugs. But she's a recovering alcoholic, and her mother's a recovering alcoholic, and that's kind of the storyline. So up until the present, there's only one storyline for alcohol, and we still have the man with the golden arm storyline for drugs. Those are the storylines. And now, however, we have streaming. And in streaming, well, first of all, it's all adults. It's not on television. And second of all, if you don't like it, you don't have to watch it,
Streaming is like it's not like a sitcom, because you don't have to keep, sitcoms, you have to have a quick character arc, like first episode in, and then keep it, and then make things either funny or interesting past that. But streaming is like, it's not like a movie, because movies are like 2 or 3 hours. If that's a long one, it's like an 8-hour movie. So you kind of get to develop things in your own unique way, which I enjoy.
I'm going to name, there were 3, I was instantly aware of streaming. I'm going to name 3 programs. What you say is somewhat true. Sometimes they go on for longer, and that's a problem because you have a storyline kind of going. Will it really work for 2 or 3 years? So,
what I think what I meant was, I think that these mini series kind of things, Queen's Gambit, Mare of Easttown, which we'll talk about. That's the sweet spot. That's what I meant to say.
I agree, because you don't run into a corner where you have to sort of make something new happen. So I watched 3 streaming programs. In the Dark, which is about a blind woman who and she drinks all the time and she gets drunk. I didn't mention this. I think Will's a little skittish around sex.
Not everyone knows who Will is, but he's the editor-in-chief of Filter Magazine, which you wrote this article for. And
she has random sex, but then a good friend of hers, who's a kid, gets murdered, and so she sort of solves the murder. And she goes against a drug kingpin on the one hand, and against a police captain on the other. So it's a cheap, and she doesn't stop drinking. And there are a lot of funny scenes in there. Like she goes to visit the kids, sort of, I don't know, some relative of somebody, maybe the cop. And she says, "Do you have any beer?" And the woman has like a 6-pack of beer, and she brings it out, and she's not going to give her whole 6-pack away. She's like a normal person. And you can see the star is drinking the beer and thinking, "Oh, for God's sake, is this it?" And so she doesn't stop being an alcoholic exactly, but and so that series might be ongoing. Then there's is it called Jessica Jones, who's a former superhero, and she now runs a private detective agency, and she drinks until she blacks out, but she solves crimes because she runs a detective agency. And then there was Good Behavior, which it was the funniest starting out, but it had an impossible plot line. It only went 2 seasons because her boyfriend is a hitman. How long can you run with that plot where your boyfriend's killing people without people saying, "Hey, I'm not liking this"? And she gets out of prison, she's on parole, and she's in recovery, but she still drinks. And in fact, she drinks with her parole officer, and she still steals. So already, nobody enters recovery. These are already, I never saw these on CBS or NBC. And now we jump in to Mare.
Okay.
And another program, you're familiar with Mare, and there's another one I don't think you've seen yet called
Go ahead.
There is a streaming series. It's all out there. It was released one show at a week, finished a couple weeks ago. It stars Kate Winslet as kind of a detective in a small, outside of Philadelphia, post-industrial town. Things aren't going well there, and her life's got problems too. And her husband committed suicide. Her father committed suicide, and her husband committed suicide. And she's worried about what's that?
Her son.
Her son.
Her husband didn't, right?
Her husband committed suicide. Her father committed suicide.
Right, her father. Right.
I think right. Her father and son committed suicide, and so she's worried. And but his son's widow is alive, and they're fighting her for custody of the kid, and she's worried about the kid. So why don't you jump in about drugs and alcohol and addiction, starting with that premise?
Look, I can tell you that right away I thought a few things were going to happen. Like I rolled my eyes and I thought a few things were going to happen. Before I watched the show, I didn't actually listen to this, but there was a podcast where they were talking to, I think, the directors and producers and writers of the show. And someone told me about this because they thought I might be interested. And people were writing in and saying, "Hey, well, you should have incorporated more harm reduction into the show." And so I thought right away, okay, so this is probably not going to be a show I enjoy. It's going to be an eye roller. It seems like as we'll get to, what that person writing in must have meant was like, you should show things like Narcan, or you should show, the staples and the billboard items of harm reduction, because
I would have thought MAT's not in the movie.
Right. MAT, right.
That was left out. Yeah, that's interesting.
But what we saw in the show, I'll just give a broad and then we can get into specifics, was just sort of how that town probably operates, and it didn't focus in on stories about rehab. It didn't, I should say this. Lots of people seem to have their life difficulties with alcohol, with drugs, with having to steal things to maintain certain habits, with just relationships, with getting by in the world, finding purpose. And it wasn't totally clear which caused which, or which was more important. The storyline was just, this is a community that people all kind of know each other, all have their struggles, and the main characters have specific struggles, but it's not, there wasn't a storyline around, well, this person drinks too much, this person does too much drugs, and there's an easy fix. So there's no arc based on that, which is interesting because that's real life. That's, if you go to a town like that, or if you just meet people and they have their problems, if you didn't know the stories that you're supposed to think, you might just say, it seems like this person has a lot of problems. It's not totally clear which is the most, biggest priority. The main character is,
and that's how we run our life process program. We don't go in, "Oh,
Right.
You have relationship addiction, or you have an eating addiction, or you have a drug addiction, or you drink too much. That's it. That's boom.
Right. As if you just need to fix that and figure out how to not drink so much, and then you'll be fine or something.
Or not
But
drink
you
at
don't.
all, as a case of the normal storyline.
So the main character, Mare, is a detective, and she's this hardened character, more hardened than even you might think someone who investigates murders and things like that might be. And the first time I got worried about this was that you you could see that she has her son committed suicide, and I thought, oh, this isn't going to be like a drug centered story and rehab centered story. It's going to be a story about this woman's trauma, and so she's got to like, she's never going to be able to make it because she's so traumatized. But what is really happening is that she drinks, and they even sort of make drinking part of her hardened character.
And she vapes.
She vapes. She has vices. She has,
I don't remember any character on TV or movies before. I don't remember them being vapors as like a thing.
And she vapes not even casually, because you don't see her vaping all the time. She gets in high intensity situations, which her work requires, and we can get into her work, which clearly gives her a purpose that moves her away from, any kind of hell she could have fallen into. But she vapes it's high intensity, and she seems like what she needs to cool her head. It's almost like she's, instead of taking deep breaths, she's vaping, and not really any other time. So that's an interesting harm reduction piece right there. She's not a smoker, but she vapes, which is probably safer. She's not, you don't see her going to the gym and lifting weights or, doing yoga or anything, but, it's basically real life kind of a thing that somebody might do to relieve stress that she doesn't have to think too much about. They don't make too much of it. So I thought that was interesting.
She very carefully, they could make her look better. Kate Winslet stars. She's in her 40s. She was fabulously beautiful and shown nude in Titanic.
Right.
She's middle-aged now, and she specifically told them, well, don't make me, they have ways they could make her look almost like she did then. You know what I mean?
It's exactly true. Everything was pretty realistic about this. Like, you kind of see, I mean, they don't say this in the story, but you can kind of imagine she probably just woke up for the gig and didn't really take a shower, and probably threw a shirt and some pants on and didn't do anything with her hair, and just a normal looking, pretty, but normal looking person who has a tough job, and
45-ish, whatever.
Right. Even though she is a completely beautiful woman. She drinks. She drinks Rolling Rock, which I thought was interesting, but you maybe cleared that up for me. I was thinking, well, she's from Easttown, and that's a Pittsburgh beer. Why is she drinking it? But apparently, a lot of people there drink Rolling Rock. I was thinking, why not Yinling? And she drinks for some of the same reasons she vapes. Although drinking's a more like, she's probably not going to wake up a day and not have a couple Rolling Rocks. It's just sort of part of her routine.
Every time she goes in a social situation in, what's it called? Easttown? What's it called?
Easttown, yeah.
Somebody offers her a drink, and virtually every time she takes a drink, except once I pointed out to you, she doesn't, which I think maybe the creators were trying to say, oh, if you think she's an alcoholic, she doesn't have to drink.
Mm-hmm.
She drinks a lot.
Right. Yeah, there was I don't want to give anything away or like give minute details, but there was a time at a bar where you could see her she was in a little bit higher stress social situation. So she had the Rolling Rock, and then she had a Jameson, and somebody else was sipping his same drink. He had a Jameson too, and she just guzzled it down. And there was that moment she's kind of going like, huh. But it didn't last very long. It wasn't like, the thing about that is she was drinking a little more than usual, a little faster than usual, but you never see her get sloppy drunk or blackout drunk. It was never part of her storyline that this person's going off the deep end. It just was kind of who she was, a character that could go on living her life and just have these, maybe not even vices, maybe life enhancement strategies that could be better or worse, but they were what they were.
And her mother, who's played by Jean Smart, who will come up again, she's sort of a miracle worker. She used to be in a comedy called Designing Women, and she's sort of a straight woman there. And all of a sudden, I don't know, she's about 60, late 60s. she's become a genius actress. And she plays her mother and she drinks cocktails. So she and her mother both drink. So you could already go, wait a second. Her, I get confused. Her father committed suicide. I think her father and her son both committed suicide. So you're thinking she's traumatized.
Right.
And, and then what's the matter with her mother? And her mother has a sharp wit, but they had a good relationship. Her mother. I'll give away the funniest scene in the movie. Sorry. They go to a wake.
We have to say spoiler alert.
Spoiler alert. They go to a wake, and for some reason, the guy whose wife has died, they've been portrayed as dysfunctional relationship.
Right.
He decides to announce to the whole crowd, and everybody in this town knows each other, and they're sitting there. They're both drinking. Mayor and her mom, and the guy gets up and says, well, I really feel I need to announce it. I had an affair with Mayor's mother. And Mayor just bursts into laughing. And our mother's going, huh? And on the car ride home, it's the funniest scene. Our mother, she's sort of a normal, she's saying, maybe a couple of times, but no, okay, maybe a little more than, and she's sort of, but Mayor's just laughing, Mayor isn't asking for an explanation, you know what I mean, or justification. And our mother's, so anyhow,
this is
not comedy, but that was funny.
This is a white blue collar place, generally, and everyone sort of has their problems, and no problem seems to be insanely bigger than other problems on the surface, and at least in the problems that are obviously further advanced, like there's a person that Mayor knew who continued to break into his sister's house to fuel his drug addiction. I mean, there are things like that are going on. Even that just came, it just dealt with in normal ways. There's like, well, what can we do? You can hear them problem solving. What can we do? Maybe there's a shelter.
It was like Gunsmoke. You're dealing with the family and the people.
Right.
And alcohol is related kind of to the crime scenes. Mm-hmm. A young woman is killed, and you go through a lot of false, we're not going to give it away, but like one guy drinks too much and he had sex with her. I don't know, was she underage or just, it was inappropriate. I don't know, it was illegal.
We're probably giving too much away if we say more about it.
All right,
but anyway.
The point of the matter is alcohol and drugs are in here.
Right.
And her son died. And her daughter-in-law has a drug background, which is what the fighting for custody is around.
But like real life, drugs and alcohol aren't accepted as excuses for otherwise bad behavior. They're not demonized for just being drugs and alcohol, and they're not accepted as excuses for an inability to be mature and live an adult, responsible life, or they're not used as excuses to absolve people of crimes.
And more than that, they never once mention AA or NA.
Mm-hmm.
They never once mention MAT, medicine-assisted treatment. Rehab, the daughter-in-law sort of goes off to rehab, but treatment's not in there. And then Mayor, for one reason or another, has to go to a therapist with the police department. And her father committed suicide and her son, so she's got stuff on her mind. And so she discusses trauma, genetic inheritance. Well, wait a second, is something inherited here? And meds, like the therapist says, well, with your son, did you ever try, meds and all? And say, well, yeah, but they had their good, and they don't say, oh, it doesn't land on something. Oh, trauma,
right,
as you pointed out, or
right.
Oh, well, they stopped taking their meds, or they didn't go to AA. None of that. There's no solution or cause that they light on. They live through their life.
There are things that there was a syringe exchange, I think, in the program. Was that in Mare? Or am I thinking of a different show?
Right.
Where it was just in passing. It just was shown long enough to know that it existed in the town. And I think they were doing something else in that.
Ethan wrote a small bit of my piece where he said he loved it. Ethan Nadelman, the pioneer in drug policy reform. There was a marijuana they were passing out flyers about a missing girl, and there was a needle exchange, and there was a marijuana shop. It sort of went through a list of modern harm reduction techniques. So obviously, as you described, the creators are aware of harm reduction, but it's not even harm reduction. It's a different level of harm reduction in the film, in the series. It's where once you say drugs are not, and alcohol are not the cause of the problem, and you're into real life, that's another view of harm reduction.
Exactly.
Well, people have to come to grips with their lives. And as I say in my piece, Mare could be viewed as a trauma victim. Some people might watch the series and say that, but she's actually portrayed as an existential hero who pursues the truth. And she sort of pisses off everybody in town trying to get to the bottom of these crimes, including her very best friend. But that's her saving grace. She's trying to find the truth. And you figure she could go off the deep end. She has a brief boyfriend in there, but he has to go somewhere. And I mean, her son's dead, and can she have a relationship? And the answer is she has a purpose. She's a police person. She's a detective.
Yeah.
She wants to find the truth and solve crimes because that's right, and that'll make things right. And that's her guiding beacon, and she can deal with life.
So I have 2 points here, and the second one relates to that. One is that I still think about Carl Hart's book where he says harm reduction has to go. And I can't help but think, what if you wrote like just 2 pages of that chapter? You, Stanton, what if you had written 2 pages of that chapter? Because it probably would have read similarly, but you would have added on something. So what you were saying is that the harm reduction is obviously something that the writers are aware of. And I think that there's a person, this is why I brought it up earlier, a person that wrote into that podcast saying, well, you should have shown more harm reduction. There are 2 ways of thinking about harm reduction. One is all the symbolism involved. So harm reduction, it's like this unfulfillable idea that these few items that are harm reduction, naloxone, MAT, needle exchanges. Well, the only way to totally fulfill harm reduction is if everyone has every one of those things every single second of every single day, and they walk around with it and they always think about it. At which point Carl's saying that's not possible, and now all you're doing is pairing the negatives of drug use with drugs in the public eye over and over again, and that's bad. Point taken, and I totally agree with him. You might say, okay, so how do you get to the other end of that? If you have sort of a ideology built or a philosophy built around harm reduction that is untenable in the end, well, how do you make it so? And the way to do that is just incorporate those harm reduction sort of principles in everyday life. And the way to do that is to kind of take life on balance and try to figure out and reprioritize and figure out how to live the best life and with a purpose. Which brings me to my next point, which
purpose, and also in her own way, like Gunsmoke, there's a community there. It's a little dysfunctional, but her mother is on her team,
and they're also the whole
husband's on her team. He's a good guy.
When you have a culture like that that's close knit, there's something that I think transcends norms. That is sort of like harm reduction. Like you see Mare, this detective, having to make ethical decisions, and she has to base that on what is actually the best for this person, and can I justify doing this even though the law says I should do something else? Should I give this person a pass? Should I, and everyone in that show is kind of weighing that. That's kind of harm reduction, where you take people as people and you see their whole beings. So she had this job that was so important to her, and at times along the way, you might say that she over-involved herself in the job, and that was sort of an escape for her, to not have to really sit and think about parts of her life that were unfulfilling to her. And so beyond drugs, the thing I started thinking about is, well, could you reasonably say that she had an addiction to her work and her work-life balance? was she working so much, the work that gives her a purpose and makes her feel well,
which they present a little bit because she sort of has a date, and the guy says, well, let's get together, and she sort of says, that's not going to happen.
Exactly. They give a few really concrete nuggets about that, like she's limiting herself and what she could possibly produce because she's so involved in the work, and you can tell that it wears her down over time too, even though she's sort of like a local hero, and it's very meaningful for her. And then you see her work into a balance, shift into balance over time, where she is involved in her work, but she is sorting out other parts of her life. And it's not perfect in the end, but it's manageable. And and she could feel like, yeah, I could maybe make a 5-year plan and maybe even get a little bit better than I am now. That's the sweet spot. That's the place you want to be, is where.
And that's what we do in the Life Process program. And that's in a way what we've lost with even harm reduction. Certainly it never existed with the 12 steps, is somehow you've got to fix the fiber of your life. That's gonna have to happen. We can jump back to Carl Hart playing basketball and Ron LaFleur becoming a Major League Baseball player. You feel better about people's chances of recovery when they've got a thing that they get involved in. And that's sort of what you want to have do. And our own son never did. And, they show him running around doing, whatever, getting drugs and all. And that's what she wants for her grandson, which, we're not going to see. He's a kid, you know what I mean? But that, you can't escape life issues by making up magical solutions. And harm reduction is a recognition that, in the meantime, it's good not to have people die. You should have needle exchanges, which they have. They portray. And, you can even use naloxone, to reverse overdoses. I don't think that happens in the movie. That doesn't happen. But that ultimately you're going to have to confront life, both as an individual and relationships, your kid, your mother, your potential lovers, and with the community. The community had to organize itself around this internal shock. Somebody murdered somebody within the community. They're going to have to digest that. And there are no shortcuts for any of that. And they have specifically made a show that describes those existential, not conflicts, journeys, odysseys. And they stuck with it, even though drugs and alcohol were kind of all around it. And so that's a whole new narrative. And of course, when you say it's a whole new narrative, you say, wait a second, that can't be a new narrative. Well, it was in Gunsmoke, and it's been throughout history. People have done that. It's only in this recent period, and I don't blame it on Candace Bergen, you know what I mean? And that show, they came at the tail end of the 80s when, after Betty Ford had introduced kind of like, oh, recovery, a nice person. She drinks too much. Where recovery has become the main meme for depicting certainly drug use. You're not allowed to use drugs. They never could comfortably portray drug use on mainstream television. That couldn't be done. There's some, efforts like, the Smothers Brothers Comedy Hour and Tales of the City, but they both got bumped. You're not allowed to just smoke marijuana like nothing. But alcohol went from, being a part of the community to being eliminated. And now this show bravely, responds and says, well, wait a second, that's not what life's about.
People are complicated, and I think it really is an art. It literally is an art, but there's something uber artistic about being able to show all facets of each character that you portray, so that you can never really land on a label for them, and then also continue to make the show extremely interesting, like you waiting on with bated breath for the next episode. And I think
obviously the stars were way important in this. Kate Winslet and Gene Smart. You said that one of the characters that you were aware of, I only know the old ones.
It's Kevin Bacon's daughter.
Who was she?
Sochi is her name. She was the ex of her deceased son, the one who's battling for custody.
I mean, I think they were together. Oh, so she played her.
Oh, right. You know what I mean. The widow. Yeah.
Her. So that's Kevin Bacon's daughter. Fascinating. And there's another show on HBO that you were less familiar with, and you saw all of Mare, and as did I. There's another show called Hacks. And in a way, it's more explicitly, first of all, because one of the main characters takes drugs. One of the people you identify with. It started, again, all of a sudden, Jean Smart, help me with my names. Is that the right name? She's the star of one of the two stars of Hacks. And in Mare, she's a little bit, behind the eight ball, a little foggy, kind of a small town mother. In Hacks, she's kind of an ex-superstar comedian, brilliant, always insulting people kind of comedian. And she's at the top of the game at Las Vegas, but she's losing it. And then they bring in a younger woman, 20-ish woman named Hannah. Can you give me the last name there?
Einbinder.
Yeah, Einbinder, who happens to be the daughter of Lorraine Newman from MSN, from Saturday Night Live, who met her father, Hannah Einbinder's in AA. So that's a whole backstory. But once again, there is one mention of NA in Hacks, but here's the storyline. Hannah Einbinder is a little bit of a lost soul. She's lost her gig in LA. She's going out to Las Vegas to help Jean Smart kind of carry on and be a star. And she takes drugs, as a normal course of events. And there's one, I can't give it all away. She's snorting cocaine with somebody in the bathroom, and that situation doesn't end well. And then meanwhile, generally, Jean Smart drinks, and they both carry on with their drinking and drug use, and nothing is portrayed as unusual or bad about it. It's who they are, although they both have problems. And then it's a kind of a generational thing. Well, these two women were very different, and Jean Smart's always rejecting Hannah Einbinder, but Jean Smart goes for a facelift. They don't give her enough Vicodin, and she turns to Hannah Einbinder for edible marijuana, cannabis, which Hannah happens to have around, and they sort of get stoned together and they become close. And then Hannah Einbinder develops some kind of a problem. They go to an emergency room, and it so happens she had taken cocaine with that guy. She had taken Molly with him, and now she had just been doing edibles. And the doctor says, "Oh, for God's sake, all the drugs you've taken, you're clearly dehydrated." And, Jean Smart character, unlike her former screen identities, can get tough when she needs to. And she starts threatening the guy, I can defund this hospital, whatever she does. He takes a CAT scan, and she has a burst ovarian cyst, and she would have died if they didn't discover that and deal with it. And so that is right out of the anti-drug stigmatization harm reduction handbook. Oh, they're taking drugs. Boom. That's the problem. And that wasn't the problem, and it saved her life. So this went one step even further than Mare of Easttown, this show called Hacks, which goes on longer. It's still not over. And once again, Jean Smart has an adult daughter. And at one point she goes through her bag looking for drugs because the daughter had been in rehab previously. And during her birthday party, the daughter's birthday party, Jean Smart says, "Oh, we can't invite any of her friends. They're all on NA." And that's the only time I believe they mention anything like that. It's sort of like a shortcut to saying, we're not going to deal with NA and NA people.
Yeah, right.
And so, and they have a toast during her birthday party. They run into problems in the birthday party because she has problems with the daughter. her daughter hasn't grown up to be an independent human being, and there's things about Jean that made that true, but it's not her drinking that caused her daughter to take drugs. And her daughter, they toast at her birthday party, and that was at a happy moment in the birthday party. And so, like Mare, for some reason, and there are one or two other programs I'm not going to get into. HBO is going into a whole new, it's almost like a corporate decision. Let's just change how we think about drugs and alcohol. Let's not have everybody who takes drugs and hacks, which is, I guess, like comedians, hacks, like, well, they just, that's the first show where a person kind of regularly takes drugs and her life isn't perfect and things sort of bad and good happen around the drugs. But that's not what the show's about. It's not a recovery show. It's not Moms. It's not, Candice Bergen and Murphy Brown. It's kind of living life using drugs and drinking, which has always been true, on an ongoing basis. The only way we'll ever change how we think about drugs and alcohol and deal with them as a society, no matter how many great policies they come up with at DPA, is when people change their consciousness, which is what Carl's shooting for. When Carl says drug use for grown-ups, he's saying, drugs, that's trying to eliminate drugs, it hasn't worked. And we try to eliminate alcohol, that hasn't worked. And having a storyline where, if you take drugs, that's bad. And if you drink alcohol regularly, that's bad. Don't do that. And let's try and get nobody to take drugs. And now they're actually, believe it or not, the World Health Organization is trying to get nobody to take alcohol by saying there's no safe level of drinking. And unfortunately, I use unfortunately in quotation marks, that's never going to happen. We know, A, that's never going to happen. It's never happened in history. B, it's less likely to happen nowadays.
Right.
I mean, they have marijuana dispensaries in these places.
Right.
Hannah got her edibles. I don't know if they sell them in Las Vegas. They might, but they sell them in LA. Drugs are more and more available, and people want to take them for whatever reasons, and Jean Smart, after facelift, wanted Vicodin because it hurt. And so we need a new relationship to alcohol and drugs. And so not only has it never been possible, not only is it less possible than ever, it's wrong to present the idea, and that's where Carl's going with beyond harm reduction, the idea, that drugs and even alcohol now, they're going back to whatever, to temperance, are always bad things. They're part of people's lives like everything else, like sex and love and eating and even gambling and gaming, certainly, that have to be integrated. So maybe, at least for HBO, I just wonder what a survey would show about HBO viewers. What are they thinking about the characters' drug and alcohol use?
Wow. What question would you pose? Like, what are two big questions you would pose to a viewer? Okay, let's say to our viewers and listeners.
Getting the message. Do you think Jean Smart's problem with her daughter is that she drinks too much? And I would hope the answer is no. That's not what it's about. Jean Smart, her husband kind of left her. I mean, she's an assertive woman trying to make a go of it, and that's a tough line of work. It's hard to do. And Hannah Einbinder is facing the same situation at a younger age. Do you think Hannah Einbinder's problems are due to her drug use? But before she takes drugs, they show her having fights with, she has like other fellow comedians, and they all say, oh, the hell with her. She only thinks about herself. She's selfish. So they really lay a groundwork that each of the women, they're appealing women, they're smart women, but they've got issues. And I'd really want to know, to the audience, do you think Hannah, I would ask, do you think her problems are due to her drug use? Do you think Hannah should give up taking all drugs? Do you think Jean Smart should quit drinking? I would think that people would say Jean Smart's is not going to quit drinking at the age of 67 or whatever that's not going to happen. And it shouldn't happen.
Here's a question I have about, similar question I have about Mare. Imagine I mean, if you took away her vape and or you took away alcohol from her life, would that make her life better or worse? And if you took those things away, what would she be up to instead? That's a very simple question. Sorry?
Is there something wrong with me? I'm reassured every time she drank, and she drank that extra scotch at a bar. I think it might have been around a date she was having.
No, I'm not asking you. I'm saying that's an open-ended question for people who are listening in. I'm of the same persuasion.
Oh, you're throwing that out there. How would people react? We know how I would react. So we're wondering, would people think?
I'll just answer it. I think that those items have satisfactory places in her life, and it's not completely clear that if you just remove those things. So someone might watch and say, "Oh, what destructive habits?" Right? But that's not what the storyline's about. So you're really not thinking that way anyway. Even if you did and you had to think about that, you might ask, if you took those things away from her life, what would she be doing instead? And would she really be better or worse off?
And that's why both those shows are great, because in an artistic and aesthetic way, they sort of make that clear. You know, you could get Mare to stop vaping and never having a beer, but then what? You know,
right.
Like, you're thinking, well, that's not the answer to anything. And if anything, it would make her life, let her have a beer, for God's sake. Right. She's not hurting anybody. She doesn't get drunk and beat anybody up. That's not the way it works.
So let me tie this into...
My question is, well, your question is, do these narratives really reshape people's thinking? And I guess I would say something more like, well, the leading edge of American, movie making or show making is now, it's beyond AA and NA. You don't watch Mare and Hacks and think, oh, if only they went to AA, everything would be good. We're beyond that.
Right.
And they may almost have skipped, they may almost have skipped MAT too. Neither of the shows is about, naltrexone. In going beyond AA and the brain disease theory and returning to the real nitty gritty of life, it's a real leap of aesthetics and thinking. And I don't think it's going to change drug policy in America. I don't think the World Health Organization is going to say, oh, we're wrong. Right. People enjoy drinking. I don't think we're going to eliminate it from the earth.
If it's good enough for Easttown, good enough for us. Right now, I don't think.
But I think it's a growing. It's a sign of advanced thinking that really, a number of public health officials and regular people have reacted to the World War, and we talked about the Atlantic article last time. Sort of reacted to the World Health Organization saying there's no safe level of drinking by saying, are they saying we shouldn't drink anymore? I'm a health conscious person. And when the World Health Organization says don't smoke cigarettes, I listen. But it's almost like, well, who needs the World Health Organization? There's alcohol and there's the World Health Organization. Who needs the World Health Organization? Versus wine. That's sort of what the woman writing in the Atlantic was saying.
Mm-hmm.
I think I'm going to go with wine,
Yeah. God, there was one final thing that I wanted to say about. Well, anyway, the whole storyline takes care of the conversation about alcohol too. That I think people go to a binary when it comes. Like there are all these groups that try to answer questions for people about what should I do? I overdrink. What should I do? And there are these really there are answers that you could fit inside of a box, and it's like, well, AA is one solution, and then there are people who posit themselves as, well, I'm non-AA, so I think you should moderate your drinking. But do you think that Mare was ever thinking when she's drinking a couple Rolling Rocks on the case that I better do this moderately, or better only have one, I better only have two? And she just it
The way we
depicts.
think about it in the Life Process program, I think I once put it this way: addiction and drug and alcohol problems are not problems of input; they're problems of output.
Yeah, that's so beautifully said. I don't even remember
In other
that
words,
quote. That's beautiful.
I mean, Mare has a job that she cares about. That's good.
Mm-hmm.
You can tell her to quit at the age of whatever she is, 45, and then what would she do? And she's trying to sort of have a relationship with a man. She's concerned about her grandson. She has a relationship with her mother. She has a relationship with the community. She has a relationship with her best friend that she has to heal. That's life.
Yeah. I can imagine a mayor in the future who unwittingly stops drinking at some occasions, like the same way that she's kind of gruff, or she's kind of like, ready for work. She's not trying to impress anybody, but then she starts going on dates, and she's cleaning up and cares about her appearance. And you might imagine that there's situations in the future whereas before she would reach in just off a habitual sort of repertoire of what you do in those situations. You grab a Rolling Rock and sit down, whatever. That she wouldn't have time for that, and she would care about what the social situation called for aesthetically.
And there was one scene in the show where they say, you want to, drink, and every time in the past she said yes. This time she said no, and it might have been because she's kind of zeroing in on some of the people in that room.
Right. So,
by the way, and there's one other scene where they went Hitchcock, where John Ford, one of the guys who, he's got a problem, not a problem. He's listed as having a drinking problem, but he has a crime problem because they start discussing one of the crimes and he leaves his beer half finished. And they're looking at that and she's thinking, he never leaves a beer half finished.
That's right. I only am thinking about that as you recall it. Yeah.
Something he doesn't want to be here having this discussion about one of the girl victims.
It's almost like a family member would say, "Hey, you okay? You didn't finish your beer tonight."
Right. It's sort of like in a great cinemas like Hitchcock or John Ford will show a scene. They don't have to write 500 words. They show one image and you're saying, huh, something's happening. You know what I mean? That's why they make movies.
So I want to move into a different topic, and you can take from whatever we've discussed already. What I should have said at the top of the interview was congratulations on publishing your memoir, which I know you've been working on for quite some time, and sort of adding to it in real time. Like you could have probably done that your entire life. You just keep adding new sections as things come up, but you finally put it to bed and it's out and it's for sale. It's called, well, why don't you talk about it a little bit and we can discuss. I have a few questions for you.
Obviously at some point you have to cut and cut, bait and cut, whatever. Mm-hmm. You have to quit. And the good news is things are still happening. And some of the things that are happening are around the memoir, like negotiating with people about interviews around that. The memoir is called A Scientific Life on the Edge, which I developed originally with a big academic publisher. And the edge is coming off the edge. You'll have to show the book in the future. It's got a picture of me looming against the backdrop of the Hudson River. And the subtitle is My Lonely Quest to Change How We See Addiction. So a lot of people like the cover, and it has some quote, and right at the top it has a quote from Maya Salovitz saying, anybody who wants to take it, learn about addiction seriously, think about addiction seriously, has to come to grips with Stanton Peel's work, and has some other back quotes. At the very bottom, it says, picture taken by Alex Clothier, who's my youngest daughter's husband. And then it says, overcoat provided by Moishe Fromberg. And I have a cousin, Rich Fromberg, who was one of the people who proofread the whole volume. That's a thankless task, thanks to Rich. And he has the same last name as the coat provider, because that's both of our grandfathers. Moishe Fromberg, who was born in the 19th century. I don't think the coat was bought in the 19th century, but it's old. And, I was wearing it for the shoot, and sometimes I wear it as a dress coat. So there's a continuity, and the book's about my life. It combines, there's a preface by Archie, a foreword by Archie, and it combines a story of the addiction world and what people believe, and many of the characters that you and I mentioned, Maya Zalovitz, Carl Hart, Ethan Nadelman, and my interactions with them, along with my growing up and how I created my ideas about addiction, and how in many ways my ideas have been adopted. For example, there's something called process addiction, and I'm sort of the inventor of process addiction, which is there are involvements that follow exactly the same patterns as substance addictions. And for that reason, I don't believe in process addiction. I believe there's addiction and more or less addiction. With
Addiction is the process.
With every process. And so, and you know, there is a movement against the disease theory now. We're talking about harm reduction, and I'm somewhat famous in the annals of history around harm reduction and around obviously opposing disease theories, and you know, talking about addiction take place. So a lot of my big themes are now. I'm in a way I'm happening, and yet I'm not happening, because I'm still not quite on the mainstream. I'm still pissing people off one way or another. My attitude towards MAT, my attitude towards trauma as being regarded as overall determinants of addiction. And if we just address things in that fashion, well, Bob's your uncle, we're home free. And even how to define harm reduction, which we've been doing in regards to, you know, HBO shows, I'm still, I don't know what's the right term, cutting edge, pissing people off, not in the bag, controversial, a contrarian, a provocateur. And, you know, I guess I identify with Mayor, and as I also mentioned in the piece about the media in Filtered, Tommy Smothers. He's a little bit of my hero. Tommy Smothers was one of the two Smothers brothers. They had a top-ranked television comedy hour, but Tommy, they kept making references to smoking marijuana, and they would have anti-war skits and singers. They brought back Pete Seeger, who had been banned for being a communist, and he sang a song called, you know, Knee Deep in the Big Muddy, which is like the Big Muddy was the Delta Mekong, and the studio and the CBS banned it. They cut it from the show, and Tommy Smothers, he just brought it back the next week. It's hard to know where this comes from. Tommy and his brother's kind of a Republican, Dick Smothers. Their father was an Army guy, and Tommy Smothers went to San Jose State on an athletic scholarship to be a gymnast. That's not usually a background profile for a political radical, but Tommy Smothers was just a guy who would never let things rest. He had a top 10 show. That's money in the bank, although I don't imagine he's poor, but he wouldn't stop nibbling at them, you know, and, you know, they say, well, why don't you send in the script beforehand? And he'd screw with them, you know what I mean? He wouldn't, or he'd change things. And so, you know, he's one of, in a way, when I wrote about Tommy Smothers being part of how marijuana was trying to be portrayed in the last century and didn't succeed, but now maybe Hannah Becker is doing it. I feel like I'm striving in a never-ending way to push the boundaries of how we, not to make things crazier, but to get deeper into understanding drugs, alcohol, and addiction.
That's key. You're not a radical for the sake of it. I mean, I think here's what a couple takeaways from the book for me. One is that you can't help it. I mean, you have a vision about what truth is, and admittedly, it's not like you know every truth, but you understand the framework for what addiction is and what steps we could start doing to make progress so that we kind of have our thoughts in order and we're going the right direction. And eventually you've seen that as like something that will probably last. That's a problem that will last even if it's going in the right direction beyond your lifetime. So one of the best things you can do, well, two of the best things you can do is, one, do what you can to keep ideas from going the absolute wrong direction, or at least call it out when you see it, because that's the intellectually honest thing to do. And do that despite what jabs people might take at your character for doing so. And the other best thing you could do is, when you see something like these HBO series that we're talking about, call it out, laud it, make it accessible for people and help them understand what is right about this way of thinking.
And one other thing I try to do, of course, I'm working with you for doing podcasts, but you're part of the Life Process program. We have a service. Let's just say it's not a disease 12-step model. It's, based on my approach to things. We're trying to extend it to MAT with one of our colleagues, Aaron Ferguson, where that's a tool, naltrexone and methadone tools as part of enhancing a person's life structure, which is what we've been talking about with Mare and Hacks. As you can't separate addiction. Where we went wrong in television and in the world is saying, oh, addiction is something outside the realm of normal things. I mean, we have a ton of psychologists, they practice CBT. We have social learning theory. People said, oh, well, that's what determines behavior and problems. But addiction, oh, that's different because it has drugs and alcohol in it. And that's wrong. And I talk about how it's wrong in my own life and in the world of addiction treatment and psychology.
And the Life Process program has this has something about it that is similar in a way. I hope I'm not going too far afield, but people are fed up with mainstream news. It's like no one actually, I mean, very few people actually align with the more extreme ideas of either political side. It's just what's available. But then you have YouTube now and podcasts, and if you're a thoughtful enough person, you can sort of select the talking heads you want to hear, who are talking maybe in a more center or moderate or thoughtful, at least, way about current events and social issues and things like that. And you can even pick your genre if you want to. The Life Process program is a sort of thing that, well, it can't be mainstream because it doesn't check any of the correct boxes for, insurance coverage.
Yes,
or
it's not going to have a show about a woman snorting cocaine and taking Molly, and that's okay. They're not going to do that anytime soon.
Right. Exactly. So we sort of fulfill a space that's clearly a real one for people with real problems who have in their best thinking don't really align with the extreme forms of rehab or whatever ideas are out there. I mean, should I admit this? I don't know, but I had a guy that was working on, let's just say it was a lifestyle kind of addiction. It didn't have anything to do with drugs or alcohol. And we were talking one day, and it was during the pandemic, and he said, "Oh," I said, "What?" He said, "I'm so sorry, I'm having a drink." And I was thinking, okay, yeah, you can have a drink. And so, oh, okay. I just thought maybe this wasn't just, no, I don't. So he was just, sipping a cocktail while he's talking to me. And it kind of sounds funny, like, what, your client's sipping a cocktail while he's at his therapy, while he's doing his like clinical work for you with addiction.
Of internet cafe, internet therapy.
Yeah.
We're offering, I mean, the ironic thing is they used to do surveys and say, oh, look how many people don't really accept the disease theory. They say they believe alcoholism is a disease, but if you ask them, are people responsible for the behavior? They say yes. Well,
Correct.
That's not true. So there's a big untapped resource in people's natural beliefs, because what we're saying is simply common sense. And it's true and it's right. And we're saying, well, we're some people who do practice according to those principles. If you are uneasy about going to AA, and 90% of people drinking problems are, well, okay, you don't have to. There are other ways to think about it. And it's not denial. It's a way that is consistent with who you are. And, as I say, I mean, the worst accusation that could almost be made about me is you could say, well, your approach is just common sense. If I would have had my grandmother, she may not be alive. If you asked her, she would say some of the things you say. And then the second thing you could accuse me and you and LPP of, well, you're just using basic psychological principles.
Mm-hmm.
People understand that people are going to have fewer difficulties and less aberrant and abnormal behavior if they feel as though they belong and they respect themselves and they have positive activities that are ego gratifying. That's just like psychology. Everybody knows that.
Yeah.
And so in a way, we're breaking down what is a great schism that occurred sometime, and I'm describing it, in Mare, in my clip with, I like that piece with Filter. It was the first one I've done this year for them, where we shifted our way of thinking. We shifted with drugs way back with the Harrison Act, 1914. So that's been going on for 100 years and more. We shifted with AA, which was kind of became big, around, 1939-ish or so. And then it became dominant in the second half of the last century, this disease idea. It's a bad set of ideas. I think Carl will go along with that one. And there's a few other people.
Mm-hmm.
And it's a bad set of ideas. And it's obviously not working. I mean, drug and alcohol problems are not going away. We're not dealing realistically with them. And from the start, when I wrote Love and Addiction with Archie in 1975, we were talking about addiction as being something that occurs in the mainstream of life on the one hand, and it's not limited to one drug. It used to just be heroin, and then we sort of broadened it to alcohol, and we broadened it to cocaine, and we broadened it to smoking. It's a whole way of relating to the world, and it needs to be detached from any one substance, heroin or opioids, and substances in general, for us to begin to understand it and to approach it, which is, again, that's the point of agreement with Carl. Carl saying, well, that's not the problem. The fact that a person takes heroin is not the problem, or crack, that we need to deal with.
I have one more insight about your memoir, specific to you, and something that I've noticed in our working relationship together, that you do really well in the book. And so I'll just reflect it and you can respond to it. And maybe this can be the last thing about, we could wrap it up with this. You have a way of what I've called before vice signaling. Like, you're kind of aware that, okay, you want to say, hey, I came up with some great ideas, maybe the most essential ideas, yet nobody's covering me. What the hell's up with that? Isn't that unfair? And it's kind of like you're anticipating people might say, well, you're a dick, so why would I cover you? And ahead of that, you're kind of saying, it's like you're beautifully saying, if you really think I'm a jerk, wait till you hear all this. And so it's like, this is just kind of me. But then you become, whatever, as I'm reading it, and I have a bias and a different idea, but as I'm reading it and I try to remove myself from just knowing you, I'm thinking, you're a human being, and you do things that make sense to you, and you are in relationships that make sense to you, and it's all in the pursuit of intellectual honesty. So you kind of lay out for people, okay, here, it's possible that in my interactions, my being sarcastic or ironic in interactions and trying to be convincing, it's possible I'm not doing myself any favors in those situations. And on the other hand, is that a requirement for having truth be propagated?
And should people just be dying like they are with drugs? And oh well, Stanton's offensive, let them die. How's that logic go?
Right. Right.
I bring that. I've never spoken for the Open Societies Foundation. Is George Soros? It's got a big drug thing. I've lived in New York now, I don't know, 40 years. I've never been invited to speak there. And the head of it dislikes me for, I don't know what reasons. And the question would be, do you think that all the millions that George Soros has spent, and it's the Open Societies Foundation, that you should prevent Stanton Peele's ideas from being heard. Now, a couple more points. One argument I have with Ethan, the head of the Drug Policy Alliance, which was originally funded by George Soros, is Ethan told me that Kasia's husband was a big AA buff in Poland. And now he disputes telling me that. When Ethan when Ethan retired from DPA, there was a party, and I'll say two things that happened at that party. One is Bob Newman was there, and Bob Newman is a methadone guy who believes that addiction is a metabolic disease. And in 1994, before the Drug Policy Alliance was created, Ethan made sure I got the Linda Smith Award, which is for lifetime scholarship. And Bob Newman got an award too for his work with methadone. But Bob Newman doesn't know me. And it's something that amuses me. I don't know why it amuses me. So at Ethan's graduation party, I went up and I said, "Hi, Bob." And Bob looks blankly at me and I said, "Oh, I'm nobody." And one of the quotes I have at the beginning, which comes from Ulysses, maybe it was a little unclear. In his travels back from Troy, Ulysses blinds the Cyclops. And before he blinds them, he says, "Oh, my name is nobody." It's sort of like, I'm nobody, but watch out.
Right.
Second thing that happened in that interaction was I had already sent Ethan, it was quite a while ago, some pieces about my career. And I talked about a man we both knew, Norman Zinberg. And Ethan goes, "Stan, you're just saying that your ideas are better than other people's." And Archie, to his credit, Archie's not a conflict guy. He said, "Oh, it's more than that, Ethan. Did you read there? Stanton's pretty honest about himself. He's willing, to let down his armor and let people see that he's, not to say he's not a perfect person, doesn't describe it, that he makes critical mistakes and has a brace of characteristics. Not everybody who writes a memoir is willing to do that." So I had to, tip my head to Archie and say, the book has the good and the bad of me in it.
There are going to be people out there who, prominent thinkers, people who are very well known, that aren't going to like that you wrote about them. And on the other hand, if I'm almost worried to know what if in a future iteration of that book, if you put me in there, it's like, why I disagree with Zach Rhodes, I'd be like, oh man, but only because it's pretty true. I mean, you say things very clearly, very truthfully, and you don't hold back, and it's not a jab any more than you take it yourself. So it really lives on balance.
At the back of the book, you are allowed to just say, "Well, this is my relationship with Stanton." You just run with it, as does one of our other counselors, D. Cloward, and a bunch of other people in my life. It's sort of like, well, here's what people experience Stanton like, and there's a few bad with the good.
Yeah. Well, okay.
You're okay with me. You're, I mentioned, I'm 75. You've given me a new life and legs to run on. I'm still not going to win the Nobel Prize, but you've given me new venues. You give me new things to think about. You've got new avenues of understanding yourself. We'll do a pay on to you at some point. What it is you bring to the table. Not like you're perfect in everything, but you've got some nuances and clicks that you brought into this whole operation that expand the base.
Well, let's leave it there for now. We discuss cultural media, television narratives about drugs, how they've kind of ebbed and flowed over time, and we're seeing a return of just being able to have television shows about real life that look like real life. And, we did that through discussing a few different HBO segments, which it looks like the HBO is the new real life. I don't know. And we were able to touch on your memoir. And I would like to, as I've mentioned before, do a more extensive interview with you about the memoir. I think I could give you an interview that is uniquely thoughtful. That's my hope. and
And you, once you
understanding
have a
of it.
cover of the book, you can prop it up there where you have outgrowing addiction so everybody can see it.
Exactly. All right,
Salute.
Stanton. Happy Sunday.